My name is Robert Castellan, and I work as a loss prevention manager for a large retail distribution center in Jersey City, New Jersey. I've held this position for 9 years. My job involves monitoring inventory movement, analyzing security footage, interviewing employees who've been flagged for suspicious behavior, and coordinating with local law enforcement when theft becomes significant enough to warrant police involvement. I'm good at my job because I'm observant and because I don't make assumptions. I look at evidence first, and I draw conclusions from the evidence rather than starting with a suspicion and working backward. I have a specific habit that I've maintained for the entire 9 years I've worked at this facility. Every morning at 7:15, I arrive at the distribution center. I make myself a cup of coffee in the break room using the machine there, and I spend 15 minutes reviewing the overnight logs before I begin my workday. This ritual has never varied. It centers me. It makes me feel prepared. My emotional weakness is that I need to believe people are fundamentally reasonable. If I'm confronted with evidence that someone is acting irrationally or without logical motivation, it creates a kind of cognitive dissonance that I struggle to resolve. I need there to be reasons for things, and my logical belief, the one I was absolutely certain about until 3 weeks ago, was that physical spaces follow physical rules, that a building is a building, that walls are walls, that distance and geometry are absolute, that you can't walk the same hallway twice and have it be a different length the second time. I'm going to tell you what happened to me, and I want you to understand that I'm aware of how this sounds. I'm aware that what I'm about to describe violates basic architectural principles. I'm aware that I could be experiencing some kind of psychological break, some kind of dissociation, and some kind of systematic misperception of reality. I've considered all of those possibilities. I've spent considerable time thinking about each one, but I need to document what happened because the alternative is staying silent, and staying silent feels like a form of complicity that I can't accept. 3 weeks ago, on a Monday morning in late February, I arrived at the distribution center at 7:15, just as I always do. The facility is a massive structure, roughly 400,000 square feet. It's organized in a grid pattern with rows of storage racks that stretch horizontally for about 200 yards, connected by corridors that run perpendicular to the racks. The administrative offices are on the second floor, accessed by a set of stairs near the main entrance. The break room is adjacent to the administrative area. The loading docks are at the back of the building. I've walked these paths thousands of times. I know the layout of this facility in a way that I know the layout of my own home. That Monday morning, everything seemed normal. I made my coffee, I reviewed the overnight logs. There were no unusual incidents reported, no alarms, no breaches, no missing inventory. The night shift supervisor, a man named Derek, had logged normal operations. I finished my coffee, returned the mug to the sink, and headed toward my office on the second floor to begin my workday. The stairs to the second floor are located about 40 yards from the break room. I've climbed these stairs hundreds of times. They're concrete and metal, fairly steep, but well maintained. It takes me about 30 seconds to climb them from bottom to top. That morning I started climbing them around 7:30, and I reached the top at roughly 7:35. When I got to the landing at the top of the stairs, I turned left, as I always do, to walk down the hallway that leads to my office. My office is the third door on the left side of the hallway. The hallway is approximately 30 feet long from the top of the stairs to my office. When I opened the door to my office that morning, I found something on my desk that shouldn't have been there. Bricky, it was a piece of paper typed roughly 8.5 by 11 inches. It was a set of instructions. The header read, "Building Protocols," and below that were 10 numbered items. I remember being confused by this because I'd never seen anything like it before. Our facility operates under standard OSHA guidelines and company policies, but I had never encountered a sheet called Building Protocols posted in any official capacity. Yet here it was on my desk. I read through the 10 items. They were fairly straightforward rules. Rule 1 stated that all personnel must remain within designated zones at all times. Rule 2 stated that access to certain areas would be restricted during specific times. Rule 3 mentioned maintaining distance from other personnel. Rules 4 through 10 dealt with break times, reporting procedures, and incident documentation. Nothing extraordinary about any individual rule, but the sheer fact of their existence, the way they were formatted, the fact that they had been placed on my desk specifically, struck me as odd. I picked up the phone and called Derek, the night shift supervisor. I asked him if he had placed anything on my desk before leaving. He said he hadn't, that he never came up to the second floor. I asked him if he knew anything about these building protocols. He said he didn't. I asked if any maintenance staff had been in the office overnight. He said no, that access to the administrative area was locked down after hours. I thanked him and hung up. I was confused, but not alarmed. The most logical explanation was that someone from the day shift had placed it there as a prank, or as part of some communication I wasn't aware of. I put the paper aside and began my workday. I had inventory reports to review, footage to analyze, and a meeting with one of the department supervisors regarding a suspected theft. The day progressed normally. Around 5 o'clock, I prepared to leave. As I was packing up my desk, I noticed the building protocols sheet again. I picked it up and looked at it more carefully. The typeface was unusual. It looked like it had been printed on a very old printer, the kind that hadn't been common for at least 20 years. The paper itself had a slight yellowing to it, as if it had been sitting in storage for some time. This detail struck me as increasingly odd, but I still couldn't construct a reasonable explanation for it. Before I left, I walked back through the administrative area and down the stairs. I made a point of asking various people throughout the facility if they knew anything about these building protocols. Nobody did. Nobody had ever heard of them. Nobody had placed them on my desk. And nobody seemed to think this was particularly unusual. The responses I got were variations of "I don't know" or "maybe it's something new from corporate." I didn't push the matter further. I figured it would be cleared up eventually, or it would turn out to be nothing important. I drove home that evening and didn't think much about the building protocols sheet. I put it on my desk at home and moved on with my evening. I had dinner, watched some television, and went to bed around 11:30, my normal bedtime. The next morning, Tuesday, I arrived at the facility at 7:15. I made my coffee. I reviewed the overnight logs. Everything was normal. I headed toward my office, climbed the stairs, turned left down the hallway, and opened the door to my office. When I did, I found a new building protocols sheet on my desk. This one was different from the first. The header was the same, but the content had changed. Some of the rules were the same as the day before, but several had been modified. Rule 3 now stated that personnel should maintain distance from other personnel except during designated collaboration times. Rule 7, which hadn't existed on the previous sheet, now stated that certain areas of the building would be inaccessible during the day shift. This was new information, and this was a rule that affected operations in a way I would have needed to know about. I immediately went back downstairs and looked for my supervisor, a woman named Patricia. I showed her the new building protocols sheet and asked her if she knew anything about it. She looked at it, looked confused, and said she had no idea where it had come from. She suggested that maybe corporate had sent it and it had gone to me by mistake. I told her that I had received a different version yesterday. She suggested I contact corporate and ask them directly. I said I would do that. I spent the next 2 hours calling various departments at corporate headquarters. Nobody had any record of sending me any building protocols sheets. Nobody knew what I was talking about. The people I spoke with suggested that maybe it was a hoax, or maybe I was mistaken about seeing them. I assured them that I had definitely seen them, that I had them in my possession, but nobody could provide any explanation for their origin. By the end of the morning, I had concluded that someone at the facility was playing an elaborate prank on me, or that something strange was happening that I didn't yet understand. I kept the new protocols sheet in my office, and I didn't mention them to anyone else. I figured that if they appeared again tomorrow, I would take it more seriously. The next morning, Wednesday, I arrived at 7:15 and followed my normal routine. Coffee, logs, stairs, hallway. When I opened my office door, there was another building protocols sheet on my desk. This one was different again. Rule 1 was essentially the same. Rule 2 now included specific reference to the basement area being off limits during certain hours. Rules 5 and 6, which hadn't existed on the previous sheets, now detailed procedures for reporting any changes in building layout or dimensions. This language was unusual. Buildings don't typically change layout or dimensions. This was bizarre language that didn't make practical sense. At this point, I was no longer dismissing this as a prank. Something deliberate was happening. Someone was leaving these sheets on my desk, and they were escalating in strangeness with each iteration. I kept this new sheet separate from the others and spent part of my morning trying to figure out who could have access to my office. The office has a lock on it, and I had the only key. Unless someone had duplicated my key, the only way someone could access my office would be if I left the door unlocked. I tried to remember if I'd locked my door the day before. I believed I had, but I couldn't be certain. I made a decision then. I would lock my office door every single time I left it, even when I was just stepping out briefly. I would pay attention to see if I could detect any signs of someone entering the space while I was away. That evening before I left for the day, I made a point of locking my office door. I checked it twice to make sure it was secure. I left the building at approximately 5:15, went home, and returned the next morning. Thursday morning, I made my coffee, reviewed my logs, and headed up to my office. My heart was actually beating faster as I approached the door. I unlocked it and went inside, and there was another building protocols sheet on my desk. This one was significantly different. The rules now numbered 15 instead of 10. Rule 4 stated that hallway length would vary depending on time of day and should not be relied upon for navigation planning. Rule 8 stated that certain corridors might not be accessible from both directions. Rule 12 mentioned that the basement area had been sealed off and should under no circumstances be accessed, with the addendum that anyone reporting basement access would be immediately terminated. My hands were shaking as I read this. This was no longer just strange or bizarre. This was concerning in a way that I couldn't easily articulate. The rules were describing a building that didn't operate according to normal architectural principles. Instead, they were describing spatial inconsistency, dimensional variability, and areas that were somehow off limits without explanation. I sat down at my desk and tried to think rationally about what was happening. The most logical explanation was that someone was deliberately attempting to gaslight me, to make me question my perception of reality. But who would do that and why? What would be the motivation, and how would they be accessing my locked office? I considered the possibility that I was experiencing some kind of psychological episode, but I had no history of mental illness, and I didn't feel like I was losing touch with reality in any general sense. I felt perfectly normal, except for the fact that someone kept leaving strange papers on my desk. I decided that I needed to catch whoever was doing this. I decided that today I would stay late, wait in the building after most people had left, and see if I could observe someone accessing my office. I didn't leave at my normal 5 o'clock departure time. Instead, I stayed in my office and waited. By 7 o'clock, most of the day shift employees had left. The facility becomes quieter as evening progresses. The night shift would arrive around 10, but there was a window of a couple of hours where the building was mostly empty. I waited in my office with the lights off, sitting at my desk, watching the hallway through the open crack of my office door. I waited for an hour and saw nothing. No movement, no sounds, no indication that anyone was nearby. At 8 o'clock, I decided to walk around the administrative area and check if there were any signs of anyone else being in the building. I found nothing. All the other offices were locked and dark. The break room was empty. There was no evidence of anyone being present. At 8:30, I returned to my office and decided to just go home. Whatever was happening, I couldn't catch it by waiting. I locked up my office and headed downstairs. As I was walking toward the exit, I passed by the security office. Derek, the night shift supervisor, had just arrived for his shift. I asked him if he had seen anyone on the way in, if there were any other people in the building besides the two of us. He said no, that he had done his standard arrival walkthrough and the building was empty except for us. I asked Derek if he had noticed anything unusual over the past few days. He looked at me like I was asking a strange question, and I clarified that I was asking if there had been any unusual activity, any security breaches, anything that seemed out of the ordinary. He said nothing unusual that he had reported. I thanked him and left. I drove home that evening feeling unsettled. I was beginning to consider possibilities that I didn't want to consider. I was beginning to wonder if the building protocols sheets were somehow appearing without human agency, if they were being printed or created by some mechanism that I didn't understand. And I was beginning to wonder if the descriptions in those sheets were perhaps not describing something that was wrong with the building, but rather describing something that was actually happening to the building. Friday morning, I arrived at 7:15. I made my coffee. I reviewed my logs. I climbed the stairs and walked down the hallway toward my office. The hallway seemed the same length as it always was, approximately 30 feet from the stairs to my office. I counted my steps to reassure myself. 28 steps from the stairs to my door. I had done this walk thousands of times. I knew the distance. When I opened my office door, there was another building protocols sheet. This one was the most extensive yet. There were now 25 rules, and many of them were specific descriptions of physical changes in the building. Rule 3 stated that the distance between the second floor and the first floor had decreased by approximately 3 feet. Rule 7 stated that the eastern corridor on the first floor would be inaccessible due to spatial compression. And Rule 9 stated that personnel should be prepared for unexpected architectural reconfiguration and should report any discrepancies to facility management immediately. I read this sheet multiple times. I was trying to understand if this was some kind of elaborate joke, or if someone was trying to communicate something to me, or if I was genuinely experiencing a psychological crisis. The fact that the rules were progressively becoming more and more descriptive of impossible spatial changes suggested that whoever was creating these sheets was either deliberately trying to make me think the building was changing, or they were describing changes that were actually occurring. I made a decision. I was going to test the rules, I was going to measure the building, I was going to verify the distances and see if they had actually changed. I spent that Friday morning with a tape measure. I measured the hallway on the second floor where my office is located. It measured exactly 30 feet, just as I had remembered. I measured the distance from the top of the stairs to the first floor. It measured 18 feet. Just as it always had. I measured various corridors on the first floor. Everything seemed consistent with my memory. But here's where the first real doubt crept in. As I was measuring, I noticed something that I couldn't quite explain. The measurement from the top of the stairs to the first floor seemed to take longer to measure than it should have. The tape measure seemed to go down more than 18 feet before reaching the bottom. But when I measured again, it came out to 18 feet. This discrepancy bothered me. Either my first measurement had been wrong, or something about the space was inconsistent in a way that I couldn't quite perceive. I decided not to mention any of this to anyone. I kept the building protocols sheets in my office, hidden in a drawer where I didn't think anyone would find them. I stopped trying to figure out who was leaving them and started focusing on trying to understand what they were describing. Over the next week, the sheets continued to appear daily, each new sheet built on the previous one, adding new rules and new descriptions of spatial changes. The rules became increasingly specific about areas of the building that were becoming inaccessible, about distances that were changing, about zones that were becoming unstable. By the following Friday, 1 week after the initial sheet had appeared, the rules included references to the building itself being in a state of controlled restructuring, that this was normal, that it should be accepted as part of ongoing facility maintenance, and that anyone questioning these changes would be considered insubordinate and subject to termination. This language changed something in my mind. The language had shifted from describing changes that might be happening to the building to insisting that these changes were expected and normal. The language was gaslighting language. It was language designed to make me feel like I was the one who was unreasonable for questioning what was happening. And that's when I decided something. I decided that I was not going to passively accept whatever this was. I decided that I was going to actively investigate. I was going to spend time in the building beyond my normal work hours. I was going to measure and verify and document. And I was going to find out exactly what was happening. That Friday evening, I stayed in the building again after most people had left. This time, I brought with me a notebook, a flashlight, and my tape measure. I decided that I would spend the evening doing a complete measurement of the building's interior spaces. I would document everything. I would create my own record of the building's dimensions. And then, the next time a new building protocols sheet appeared with claims about spatial changes, I would have data to verify or refute those claims. I started on the first floor. I measured each corridor from end to end. I measured the width of each storage aisle. I measured the height from the floor to the ceiling. I documented everything in my notebook with precise measurements and sketches. The work was tedious, but it was also calming. It gave me something concrete to focus on, something I could control. By 10 o'clock, I had completed the first floor. Everything measured out consistently. There were no anomalies. The building seemed entirely normal in terms of spatial dimensions. I headed upstairs to begin measuring the second floor. The second floor is smaller than the first floor, primarily consisting of office spaces and the break room. I measured each office, the hallway, the break room. Everything seemed normal. I was just finishing my measurements of the hallway when I decided to test something. I decided to walk the hallway and count my steps. The hallway is lined with offices on both sides, and it extends from the stairs at one end to a dead-end wall at the other end. I had walked this hallway countless times. I knew it was approximately 30 feet long. I started at the stairs, and I began counting my steps as I walked toward the far end of the hallway. 1, 2, 3, 4. My steps are relatively consistent in length. I estimated my stride length to be about 2.5 feet. So 30 feet divided by 2.5 feet would give me approximately 12 steps. I counted as I walked. 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. I reached the dead-end wall and I had taken 15 steps, not 12. 15 steps would be approximately 37.5 feet. But my tape measure had shown the hallway to be exactly 30 feet. I measured it again with the tape measure. 30 feet. Shanti, but when I walked it and counted steps, it was more like 37 feet. This discrepancy was impossible. Either my tape measure was broken or my stride was inconsistent, or something about the space itself was variable. I tried again. I measured the hallway with the tape measure 30 feet. I walked it and counted steps. 15 steps, approximately 37.5 feet. I tried a third time, measuring and walking. Same result. The tape measure said 30 feet. My stride said 37.5 feet. I stood in that hallway and I felt something shift in my mind. I felt my certainty about the nature of physical reality beginning to crack, because what I was experiencing didn't fit into any rational framework. My tape measure was not broken. My stride was consistent. And the hallway was somehow different, depending on how I measured it. I packed up my materials and left the building around 11 o'clock that night. I drove home in a state that was somewhere between curiosity and dread. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking about the hallway, about the discrepancy between my measurements, about what that discrepancy might mean. Saturday morning, I woke up and immediately called a friend of mine, a physicist named James, who teaches at a local university. I didn't want to tell him what I was experiencing, so I asked him a hypothetical question. I asked if it was possible for a physical space to have variable dimensions depending on how it was measured. He laughed at first, thinking I was joking, but when he realized I was serious, he asked me what I was talking about. I said it was a theoretical question for something I was working on. He said that, theoretically, certain quantum phenomena could create measurement-dependent outcomes, but that such effects would be microscopic and wouldn't apply to human-scale spaces. He said it was fundamentally impossible for a hallway to be 30 feet when measured with a tape measure, but 37 feet when traversed by steps. He said such a thing would violate basic geometric principles. I thanked him and ended the call. His explanation didn't help. It just reinforced the fact that what I had experienced was impossible. And yet I had experienced it. So either the impossible had become possible, or I was fundamentally misperceiving what was happening. I spent that Saturday in a strange state of paralysis. I didn't want to go back to the building. I didn't want to continue investigating, but I also couldn't stop thinking about what I had discovered. I spent the afternoon trying to construct alternative explanations. Maybe my stride length had been different than I thought. Maybe I'd miscounted my steps. Maybe my tape measure was faulty despite appearing to work correctly. But none of these explanations felt adequate. And underneath all of it, I could feel a growing sense of certainty that something genuinely strange was happening, something that violated my logical understanding of how the world works. Sunday morning, I received a text message. It was from Patricia, my supervisor. She said that Derek, the night shift supervisor, hadn't shown up for his shift Saturday night and hadn't called in. His car wasn't in the parking lot. His cell phone was going to voicemail. It appeared he had simply vanished. She asked if I had any idea where he might be. I said I didn't. She said she was concerned and was going to file a missing person report with local police. That message unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Derek had been a reliable employee. I couldn't imagine him just not showing up for his shift without calling in. I couldn't imagine him disappearing. And the timing of his disappearance coinciding with my investigation into the building felt like more than just coincidence. Monday morning, I returned to the building. I made my coffee. I reviewed my logs. I climbed the stairs and walked down the hallway. I counted my steps. 15 steps. The tape measure said 30 feet. The discrepancy was still there. I opened my office door and found another building protocols sheet, wherein this one was different from the previous ones. It was much shorter. It contained only 5 rules. Rule 1 stated that certain personnel were not authorized to investigate building dimensions and would be removed from the premises if they continued to do so. Rule 2 stated that the building was undergoing a controlled restructuring process and that this process was normal and necessary. Rule 3 stated that attempting to document or report building changes to external parties would result in immediate termination and legal action. Rule 4 stated that the building would continue to restructure itself and that personnel must adapt to these changes. Rule 5 stated that anyone who failed to adapt would be removed from the building permanently. The specificity of these rules was not coincidental. Someone or something knew that I had been investigating. Someone or something knew that I had measured the building. Someone or something knew that I had been counting my steps. And whoever or whatever it was warning me to stop. This is where I made what I now understand to be an irreversible decision. This is where I decided that I was not going to be intimidated. I was not going to stop investigating. I was not going to accept the possibility that something was happening in my workplace that I didn't understand. I was going to continue my investigation, but I was going to do it more carefully and more systematically. I created a comprehensive plan. I was going to spend entire evenings in the building, measuring and documenting everything. I was going to create detailed records of all measurements. I was going to look for patterns in the changes. I was going to try to understand the mechanism by which the building was allegedly restructuring itself. And I was going to be very careful not to let anyone know what I was doing. Monday evening, after everyone had left, I began my systematic investigation. I spent 6 hours in the building that night, measuring and documenting. I measured every corridor on the first floor at least 5 times, recording each measurement. I measured hallways on the second floor. I measured vertical distances. I documented everything in a notebook with precise measurements and sketches. And what I found was terrifying. Some of the measurements were consistent, exactly as I had expected them to be. But other measurements were variable. The eastern corridor on the first floor, which according to the most recent building protocols sheet, was supposed to be inaccessible due to spatial compression, measured differently each time I measured it. The first time I measured it, it was 42 feet. The second time it was 38 feet. The third time it was 45 feet. The measurements were not random, but they were clearly variable, and they seemed to be changing in a pattern that I couldn't quite discern. By the time I left the building that night, I had documented approximately 300 individual measurements. I filled an entire notebook with data. And I was beginning to form a hypothesis. I was beginning to think that the building was actually doing what the building protocols sheets said it was doing. I was beginning to think that the building was genuinely restructuring itself, that its dimensions were genuinely changing, and that these changes were being controlled or directed by something that was aware of my investigation. Tuesday morning, I arrived at the building at 7:15. I made my coffee, I reviewed my logs, and I went to my office expecting to find another building protocols sheet. I did. This one was different again. It now contained 30 rules. Most of the new rules dealt with specific restrictions on building access. Certain areas were now completely off limits. The basement was now explicitly sealed, and anyone attempting to access it would face immediate termination and criminal charges. The eastern corridor was now designated as a restricted zone. Several of the offices on the second floor were now marked as off limits. And then there were the new rules that described the ongoing restructuring process in more detail. Rule 19 stated that the building was being optimized for a specific purpose that would be revealed in due time. Rule 22 stated that all personnel must comply with building protocols without question or face removal. Rule 27 stated that the building's restructuring process was accelerating and that personnel should expect increasing spatial inconsistencies. I sat at my desk reading these new rules, and I felt something shift in my mind. I realized that I was no longer investigating something mysterious. I was no longer trying to figure out something strange. I was now inside something. I was inside a process, and that process was continuing to evolve. In response to my investigation, I made a decision. Or I was going to leave, not for the day, but for good. I was going to resign from my position and walk away from this situation, because whatever was happening in this building, it was beyond my ability to understand or control, and continuing to investigate it seemed increasingly dangerous. But then I thought about Derek. I thought about how he had disappeared. I thought about whether his disappearance was connected to the building's restructuring. I thought about whether he had discovered what I was discovering and had been removed because of it. And I thought about whether leaving the building would actually remove me from the situation or whether it would just remove me from my ability to understand what was happening. I spent that Tuesday in a state of internal conflict. Part of me wanted to just walk out and never come back. Part of me wanted to continue investigating. Part of me wanted to report everything to some kind of authority. But what authority would I report to? Who would believe me? Who would believe that a building was somehow restructuring itself according to rules that were being posted on sheets of paper that appeared on my desk? By the end of Tuesday, I still hadn't made a decision. I went home and spent the evening thinking about what to do next. Wednesday morning, I arrived at the building at 7:15. This time, my ritual felt different. Making the coffee felt like it might be one of the last times I made coffee in this break room. Climbing the stairs felt like climbing stairs for perhaps the last time. Walking down the hallway felt like traversing a space that was becoming increasingly unstable. When I opened my office door, there was another building protocols sheet, and this one was the most direct yet. It consisted of a single rule that took up most of the page. The rule stated, Robert Castellan has been chosen for the next phase of the restructuring process. He will report to the basement entrance at 6 p.m. today. Failure to comply will result in mandatory removal from the building and all associated consequences. My hands were literally shaking as I read this. This was not a vague threat. This was not an abstract rule. This was a direct command addressed to me specifically by name. Someone or something knew exactly who I was and what I had been doing, and it was now demanding that I go to the basement, which according to all previous rules had been sealed off and restricted. This was the moment where I understood that I was no longer investigating something. I was being investigated by something, and that something had decided that it wanted to interact with me directly. It had decided that I was ready for the next phase of whatever process was happening in this building. I sat at my desk for a long time after reading that rule. I was trying to decide what to do. The rational response would be to leave the building immediately and never come back. The rational response would be to go to the police and report what was happening, even if they didn't believe me. The rational response would be to contact someone, tell someone, involve someone else in what was happening. But there was another part of me, a part of me that wanted to know, a part of me that had been investigating this situation for weeks and that wanted to see where the investigation led. A part of me that was curious about what the next phase would be. And that part of me was growing stronger as the day progressed. I spent the entire day trying to convince myself not to go to the basement. I told myself that it was dangerous. I told myself that I was crazy for even considering it. I told myself that whatever was in the basement was something I shouldn't encounter, but by the time evening came around, I had made my decision. I was going to go to the basement. I was going to see what was down there. I was going to meet whatever was orchestrating this situation face to face. At 5:45, I made my way to the basement entrance. I had been to the basement many times before. It was a storage area for maintenance supplies and archived records. It wasn't a particularly memorable or special place. It was just a basement. It had always been accessible during normal business hours, though the building protocols sheets had indicated that it was now sealed off and restricted. When I reached the basement door, I noticed something different. The door was unlocked. In the past, you needed a key to access it, but now it was simply unlocked, as if it was waiting for me to enter. I opened the door and looked down the basement stairs. There was light coming from below, illuminating the stairway. This was unusual. The basement usually required you to turn on the lights after you entered. I descended the stairs slowly. Each step felt significant. Felt like I was crossing a threshold that I couldn't uncross. Then I reached the bottom of the stairs and looked around. The basement was different from what I remembered. It was larger than I recalled it being, and it was organized differently. The storage shelves were arranged in patterns that I didn't recognize. And in the center of the basement, there was something that definitely hadn't been there before. It was a structure. Not a large structure, but a definite construct of some kind. It was roughly 10 feet in diameter and made of what looked like metal framework, with various components attached to it. It had a slight luminescence to it, and standing next to it was Derek. Derek was standing completely still, his eyes open but unblinking, his arms at his sides. He appeared to be alive, but he was motionless, almost statue-like. I moved toward him slowly, and as I got closer, I realized that he was breathing, that his chest was rising and falling, that he was in some kind of conscious but immobilized state. "Derek?" I said. No response. I reached out and touched his arm. His skin was cool and firm. He didn't react to my touch at all. He just stood there, unmoving. I looked back at the structure in the center of the basement, and then I understood something. I understood that Derek was connected to the structure. That whatever was happening in this building, Derek was now part of the mechanism. Derek was part of the process. Derek had been chosen for the next phase, and he had been converted into a component of whatever was restructuring the building. And I understood then what the building protocols sheet meant when it said that I had been chosen for the next phase. It wasn't inviting me to participate. It was telling me that I was going to become part of the structure, that I was going to become connected to whatever was happening in this building, just like Derek had become connected. I turned and ran back toward the stairs. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I just ran. I ran up the stairs and out of the basement and closed the door behind me. I ran through the first floor and toward the main exit. I didn't stop to think. I didn't consider what was happening. I just knew that I needed to get out of that building immediately. I made it to my car and I drove away. I drove for about 20 minutes without any clear destination, just driving, putting distance between myself and that building. Eventually, I pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner and I sat there, trying to process what I had just seen. And Derek was in that basement, connected to some kind of structure, immobilized, seemingly integrated into whatever mechanism was restructuring the building. And I had been about to become integrated into that mechanism as well. And the building had been guiding me toward that outcome through the building protocols sheets, gradually escalating the instructions, gradually making the situation more explicit, until I was ready to walk down to the basement and become part of the process. I didn't go back to the building that night. I went home and I tried to sleep, but I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing, trying to understand what I had seen, trying to figure out what the structure was, trying to figure out what the building was doing and why. Thursday morning, I didn't go to the building. I called in sick. I told them I was experiencing some kind of acute illness, and that I would try to return on Friday. My supervisor, Patricia, was understanding. She said that Derek still hadn't been found and that the police were investigating his disappearance. She asked if I had any information that might be helpful. I said I didn't. I spent that day trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to go to the police and tell them everything, but what would I tell them? That the building was restructuring itself? That Derek had been integrated into some kind of structure in the basement? They would think I was crazy. And I wasn't even certain myself what I had seen. Maybe I'd hallucinated it. Maybe the stress of the investigation had caused me to imagine the structure and Derek's immobilized state. But I didn't believe that. I knew what I'd seen, and I knew that something genuinely strange was happening. Friday morning, I made a decision. I was going to go back to the building. I was going to walk in like nothing had happened. I was going to get my belongings from my office, and I was going to resign and walk out and never come back. I was going to remove myself from the situation cleanly and completely. I arrived at the building at 7:15. I made my coffee, even though I knew it might be the last coffee I made in this break room. I reviewed my logs, even though I knew the logs didn't matter anymore. I climbed the stairs. I walked down the hallway, counting my steps. 15 steps. The hallway was 37.5 feet long, not 30 feet. The measurement had changed. Or the hallway had always been 37.5 feet, and I had simply been misperceiving it. I opened my office door, and there was one final building protocols sheet. This one was very short. It contained a single line of text. The line read, "The building has incorporated your investigation into its restructuring process. Your departure does not remove you from the process. The process is ongoing. You will return." I read that line multiple times, and I understood then that I was no longer choosing my own path, that whatever was happening in this building had incorporated me into its process simply through my investigation of it, that by trying to understand what was happening, I had become part of what was happening, and that no matter whether I stayed or left, the process would continue, and I would eventually be drawn back to it. I packed my personal belongings into a box. I left my office key on the desk. I walked out of the building, and I haven't returned. That was 3 weeks ago. I submitted my resignation by email, stating personal reasons. I've been trying to move on with my life. I've been trying to forget about the building and the building protocols sheets and Derek and the structure in the basement. But something has changed in how I perceive the world. I notice now that distances seem variable depending on how I measure them. I notice that hallways in other buildings seem to shift slightly when I'm not looking directly at them. I notice that other people seem to be acting in ways that are subtly coordinated, as if they're following protocols that I'm not aware of. And I notice that I'm thinking about that building more and more, that I'm dreaming about it, that I'm planning the route back there. And the most disturbing thing is that I'm no longer certain whether I'm considering returning because I'm being drawn back or because I genuinely want to understand what happens next. I'm no longer certain whether I'm experiencing reality accurately or whether my perception of reality has been fundamentally altered by what I experienced in that building. I'm writing this now because I need to document what happened while I still have the capacity to document it. I need to create a record of my experience before I lose the ability or the will to do so. Because I think that whatever process was happening in that building, I'm still part of that process. And I think that process is gradually changing me in ways that I can feel but can't quite identify. And I think that eventually that process will draw me back to the building. And I think that when I return, I'll be ready to go to the basement. I'll be ready to see the structure again. I'll be ready to meet Derek and understand what he's become. And that terrifies me more than anything, because I'm not certain whether that terror is genuine fear of something dangerous, or whether it's fear of something inevitable, whether I'm afraid of what will happen when I return, or whether I'm afraid of how much I'm actually looking forward to returning. The building incorporated my investigation into its restructuring process. My departure did not remove me from that process. The process is ongoing.